All right, terrific. So we are the Agile Wargaming team, also known as the Foxes. We are contractors in support of, as mentioned, the Air Force Warfighting Integration capability. But before we go into a lot of what we do, it would be important that you guys hear who we are. Oh, I forgot the boilerplate. Very important. We're going to talk about a lot of things. Everything we say are our views alone. They do not necessarily reflect the views, policies of any company or government organization. Although if I tell you I think the Air Force is pretty cool, the Air Force agrees with that. So who am I? I got some pictures here. Again, name's Phil Bolger, to an institution in the Hudson Valley that was very mean. 1st Armored Division, when I was in, I did one tour in Iraq, which was 4 months of filling up connexes, and one tour to Afghanistan, which was 9 months of advisory with an Afghan Kandak. Is that better on the audio?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'll let you know if it kind of cuts out again, Phil.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. My internet decided to pick today to act up. So again, who am I? This says a lot of what I was saying, but in writing. However, the last 2 bullets are important. I am a published author. I've written 1 full-length novel and 3 short stories. So I do have a bit of a creative bent, which helps me in my current profession. But even that is not why I'm at my current job. Slide, please. The short answer is, this is my expertise, gaming. Which right now I'm sure is a few wide eyes and a, really, Phil? You get paid for playing games? Well, no. I get paid for knowing about games. I get paid for knowing what the overlap is between practice of the military art and commercial games. So every single game on here is something that either I have played or hope to play in the case of one that hasn't been released yet and one that's technically a rework of a game that's already out. But as you may notice, there's a wide variety of different types of games here, ranging from board games to video games to tabletop role-playing games. I know Merle's in the audience, so I'll take the opportunity. The one way down at the bottom, the National Security Decision-Making game, is a big, huge quasi-seminar LARP. It's described as Model UN on Crack. I highly recommend it. And yeah, I could see Merle happy in the comments. Definitely a good thing to experience. But all of these are different sort of game systems, and each of them have different values, good, bad, and indifferent. It's important for anybody in this profession to play a lot of games. Regardless of what type they are, you will be able to find useful things in them. I'll go more into that in a second. I'd like to break and hand it over to my co-host, Lexee Brill, so she can tell you about herself.
All right. So following Phil's format and lead, a little bit about me. You have my puppy Elvis there. Yes, he is going to be a Christmas tree this Halloween. Alma mater is Claremont McKenna College, and I am currently a Georgetown Hoya at the Security Studies program. I'm actually the programming director for Goose, the Georgetown University Wargaming Society. I'm a Fox. I love to stress bake. Phil can attest to this. And then I love to go on hikes with my partner down there on the bottom left. So a little bit about me. Majored in international relations, graduated from Claremont McKenna in 2016, focused on East Asia and specifically the intersectionality between technology and military technology and international relations. Newly converted hobby gamer, so Phil and my fellow Foxes can take partial credit for that. And I speak a bunch of languages, which really helps me have a whole bunch of ties to some of the red teaming stuff that we need to do. So this is my slide of games. You'll notice I also have Twilight Struggle on there. And mine are a little bit more PG. Yes, I am still pushing for us to use a Candyland-esque game in our work life. But some of these games have been really good for just learning different mechanics for me, because I'm not the avid hobby gamer that Phil is. And Phil.
All right, so before we talk about what Agile Gaming is, it's important to talk about what underpins this. And what underpins all of our work are abstract systems that make up a game. Or in the immortal words of Call of Duty Black Ops, the numbers, Mason, what do they mean? So any game is an inherently abstract system with interactive parts that represent things from the real world or fantastic things imagined by the designer, ultimately converted down to numbers. If you look over at the right, I have a sheet of counters from Draco Ideas' Help Arrives, which is a game currently on Kickstarter about the Spanish Civil War. Each one of those tokens has several numbers on them with different colors, different icons, different shapes, along with a title. There's pictures, there's artwork. But if you don't have the manual for Help Arrives, they're all meaningless. You can guess at what some of them mean. You can assign them your own values, but functionally, it's just numbers on cardboard. What gives them any kind of meaning is the context given by the design team. This context may be visual. In the case of a video game, you're never going to see the math. You're just going to see the visual indicators that the math is happening, or by a rule set, by what's on the table, or the player's imagination. So each of these numbers are only as useful as the context is able to get them. In turn, anytime you teach somebody a game, you have to teach them what each number on the counter means. You have to teach them how they interact. You have to teach them why they're important to memorize. This is a big load on the player. I'll get more on that in a second. But functionally, all of these numbers exist to interact with each other. Slide, please. Once you understand what underpins a game, you can understand how it interacts with other parts of the game. In other words, if I tell you that one of those numbers is, say, an assault value, you understand that there is an action in the game called assault. You understand that assault means these values are stacked up against each other, whether rolled directly or rolled on a combat resolution table. It becomes apparent that assault is part of that game. For the Spanish Civil War, close combat is going to come into play. So that's reasonable. If I tell you that leadership is a value, you understand that the game creator thinks leadership is important. They've quantified it in a way that they have to apply that. So once you understand sort of what all those are, you can look at what systems hold things together. How do things interact? And that is the game logic. That is how a game plays. One of Lexee and I's joint games that we have on ours, Twilight Struggle, is played primarily through a couple different actions. They're all played off of cards, whether during the headline phase or whether during the action phase. Then in turn, you can either spend a card for the event or you may spend it for operations points. This is the game's logic. It is not possible, no matter how much some friends that I have would wish otherwise, that you can show up to Twilight Struggle and say, well, that's it. I'm rolling across the Fulda Gap right now. World War III is on. The only mechanism in the game for you to do that is going to DEFCON 1, which would lose the game. So you have to understand how games logic work in order to understand, one, what is valuable about them, two, what you can take from them, and three, what you can learn from them. So these underlying numbers that hold all of this together, they may be modifiers, they may lead to a table, or they may be a resource or a track. Most of these numbers can be modified, some cannot. The game is played primarily through modifying these numbers. The simplest games, such as checkers, are nothing more than strategic resource management. In checkers, every move that I take should be either reducing my opponent's stockpile or improving my own stockpile by attempting to get king pieces, which can then move backwards on the board. Once you understand the numbers behind that, you could just make checkers in Microsoft Excel. I wouldn't recommend it. It wouldn't be a lot of fun, but it's the same principle. That said, when we gave a rehearsal of this to our boss, Ian Hoffer, he interjected something very interesting. He said, yeah, well, what if I'm stupid? And since it's Ian, we were able to imagine that very easily. The bottom line is never underestimate the human factor. Humans, given choices, don't always pick what's logical or what helps them. And particularly with defense clients, when you set something out in front of them, sometimes they really blow your mind by choosing something that seems totally illogical, but to them, it is the natural result of external training or social or external social norms, whether societal-wise or organization-wise, or because it's just what occurs to that person. Slide, please. So once you understand that any game is systems, you have to understand that all games are a balanced choice between complexity and fidelity. Complexity is how easy is it or how simple is it? We prefer simplicity. And fidelity is how true to life is it? Is it very true to life? Is it not very true to life? Generally speaking, not 100% of the time, the more true to life it is, the more complex it is, which can make it difficult to play. Before I go any further, I'd like to say in the chat, if you could type whether you've played either of the two games I have over on the right, Axis and Allies and World in Flames. Both are strategic simulations of World War II. Tell me if you've played one, either, or both. So the more complex a game is, the longer it takes to run and the more people it takes to run it. Complexity is not inherently evil, but it is inherently time consuming. The more complex you have of a game, the longer it will take to play any one move. So taking a look over in the chat, I see a few boths. I see a lot of Axis and Allies and one Axis and Allies, and yes, the predecessor to World in Flames. Oh, sir, I am impressed. It's not a coincidence that most of you guys, if you've played one, have played Axis and Allies. It's low fidelity, it's low complexity, and it's just more prevalent as a result. Generally speaking, the higher complexity of a game and the higher fidelity it is, the harder it is to find players. It takes more time. Especially as you get older, not everybody can give up 12 hours a day to play war games. Basically, nobody I know can. Maybe I just run in different circles, and there's still a lot of people out there. But from what I've seen, that's pretty typical. So, lastly, automation can mitigate some of the complexity, but tools and applications have a lot of front-end work to be executable on game day. I could make a bot that could tell me what the best move in World of Flames was, always. But it would take me a lot of work. I would have to code in every single decision and code in some kind of an optimization routine. And by the way, I don't know how to code, so I'd actually have to hand this off to somebody else, or otherwise it's just going to be numbers on a screen and not the kind I can interpret. So the end result is that automation can help, but it's not inherently it's not a do-all. Automation will not save you if you do not put the time in. The other thing I will warn you about automation is that automation that is not ready on game day is worse than no automation. Have a backup plan. I'll go more into that later when we talk about the Agile approach. Before I go any further, are there any questions about complexity versus fidelity in this trade-off? All right, with nothing seen, let's continue. So why do we care about game systems? I just told you guys all this stuff about game systems and the meaning of numbers, and that's great, Phil, but this is supposed to be about Agile Wargaming. Agile Wargaming as it helps the Department of Defense. So why we care about them is the first bullet. It's the military art is incredibly complex. No one person is capable of mastering it. No, not even you, Clausewitz or Sun Tzu. You guys may have gotten closer than the average mortal, but the end of the day is that the military art is so incredibly complex, it is virtually impossible to master, period. Each of the 5 warfighting domains can be studied for a lifetime without 100% mastery over that domain. My father retired from the Army after 35 years of service. There were still things that I talked about with him about the land domain that he was surprised to learn. So the more expertise you can pull from, the closer you will get to reality. But for Agile Gaming, it's difficult to have experts on call at all times. With large-scale games, they do tend to have more experts on call. A lot of times, this is mandated by the nature of being a Title 10. We don't have that luxury, either in time of coordination nor prestige of office title. We cannot simply call up an 06 from a random branch and say, hey, sir, we need you to give up 3 hours this Friday. We have to ask. However, when you can't get an expert, something that you can substitute is a system. I do have it bolded, though, for reasons. Systems can proxy for experts, but only if they have expert input and can be modified upon review. I can promise you, you do not want to be the person submitting a broken tool about hypersonics to somebody with a doctorate in hypersonics who has to explain that's not how they work. So you want to make sure that not only do experts review them, but they can be changed. The last bullet, though, is something that we're going to repeat more and more times. The more systems you have, they require fewer people to execute and fewer players to run. To the right, I have a game, Next War Taiwan, a Mitchell Land design published by GMT originally in 2014. It is a very fun game, I think. Played on the standard rules, it's doable in an afternoon, and played on the advanced rules, don't play it all in one sitting, trust me. But either way, it allows a million-strong multi-domain invasion to transform into a game played by 2 people. That is the value of systems. Now, all of these systems abstract reality. All of them are not one-to-one. With each system you add, you're a step further away from ground truth. When you're messing around with this, it's important that you remember it as a designer, but it is also important that you communicate it to the client. They need to understand that we know this is not a ground truth, and that's okay. If it's a partial solution, that's good enough for reasons Lexee's about to go into. Slide, please. So our approach boils down to, we would rather have 10 people play a simple game with a 1-month turnaround than 100 people play a complex game that takes half a year to create. And I need to specify, this isn't a knock on complex wargaming. We believe that Title 10 wargaming is an important part of the decision cycle. However, it's not what we do, at least not directly. We do work in support of that. And it's not something that our 7-person team would be particularly effective at. If you guys get the chance to attend an Air Force Title 10 war game, you will have the pleasure of watching a guy named Matt Neuenswander, goes by El Cid, just run the room like a circus. He is the ringmaster, he cracks the whip, and him and Britney Spears make sure we all stay in line. But in all seriousness, it's very impressive to watch how much he juggles. He juggles over 50 or 60 experts, in this case, spread across several different stations, several different time zones, and several different availabilities. None of us have that experience of running that many people. None of us have the prestige to stand behind that. So our games do work best in concert with other research systems, complex war games such as Title 10 war games, modeling and simulation in all of its myriad forms, and operations research all work in a push-pull dynamic with our team. Our games are used to highlight human decisions that models may not accounted for. Likewise, if we need data about physics, probability of kill, or the effectiveness of a certain system in certain circumstances, a model is way better than what we do for that, so we lean heavily on them. The last thing that I have on the Agile approach from a game design standpoint is that it's very common in most large-scale games that you never really meet the people that are playing until game day. You may meet 1 or 2 sponsors that will see you check out the game, say, yes, this is something we want, but you don't meet the majority of people until they show up. Agile Gaming works with the people that are going to play for as long as you can, to a point that usually we run iterations of the game as a play test with our clients before we run it for real with a wider audience. This helps us immensely. But that's just the start of our approach. I'm going to hand it over to Lexee, who's going to take you guys way deeper down the rabbit hole.
Awesome. So just about Phil's last point there, we sit and we're kind of embedded there with our clients and our sponsors. And so these are our game sponsors. So to answer one of the questions in the chat, we get these really kind of new concepts or ideas. And because we sit there and we're sitting next to the people who are discussing these ideas, say, an idea for a new missile, we kind of by osmosis and observation can see how important it is, where it fits in the larger operating picture, or even if it's of strategic value there. So that's kind of like our first osmosis filtration that we go through when we try and determine a game. And by sitting there, we actually can shorten our timelines. If we're seeing things on the ground, we can react or interact with the sponsors just in a lot quicker timeline. Sometimes 3 days. I think Phil and I turned a game around in, I think we're down to 4 days as our fastest, from getting a new idea to having some cards ready to present and run a group of about 5 to 8 people through. So that being said, Agile Gaming works best on these newly formed concepts or ideas. And I'm a big metaphor and analogy speaker. So I kind of think of this as like a newborn going to pre-K, right? These ideas or concepts aren't ready for prime time. They're not necessarily bad. They just need a little more help. They need to be better written, or they have too many questions or too many hypotheses. So what we do is we examine how we can either test a hypothesis, test a few variables, and really focus on the changes that are most likely to either move the needle or make that difference in the larger picture. So having these subject matter experts or organizational points of contacts really help us narrow down the scope to what is most relevant. And this is just kind of part of our internal brainstorming session. You'll see over there on the right, I have Mika Zinko's Red Teaming book, and he kind of goes through this in a lot more detail if anyone's interested about sitting there, learning by osmosis, and then just thinking critically about the things you are seeing and how you can use wargaming, particularly some of the games that Phil's gone over and some of the interactive systems to better test ideas and concepts that you're seeing. So just that last bullet there at the bottom, part of the Foxes as a team's process is to conduct independent research. We want to prevent as much bias as possible, right? So I'm coming at this from a data science background or data analysis background, and I'm saying, you know, we don't want to be an advocate either intentionally or unintentionally for any sort of platform or system. So when we get something in our hands, we kind of turn inwards and we say, hey, let's look for research over here. If we have a missile system, we just don't take it from the person who's handing it to us. We go and touch research labs or think tanks and compile our own ideas about the concept before we reach back out to that sponsor and try and narrow down their research questions. So that's kind of the Agile approach and how things work. Our timelines are very tight. And so before I get into how we as a team function in those tight timelines, I'm going to pause here for any questions. Awesome. So one of the things that allows us to meet these tight timelines, you heard Phil and I talking about taking a gaming concept in 4 days from me saying, Phil, here are my questions. Here's what I've tried that doesn't work. And in this instance, he had a hobby, a commercial game that could get to these questions in a very clear manner. And it was just a matter of putting the Air Force concepts layered over this commercial game, incorporating it and making sure that the systems worked within each other before going back 4 days later to go ahead and run this. So obviously a huge part of that is me actually talking to Phil, right? So Agile Gaming works best when your personnel have a combination of specialties, but not necessarily a single specialty. So really good example of this is I did not play video games coming into wargaming. I did not even play board games. I think I have about 3 of my own war games in a box, and I have 4 of Phil's. And part of that is just everyone on the team wants to run games. If everyone comes from a different background and has different specialties, the one thing that is universal on an Agile gaming team is everyone has this drive and this ambition to put on games, to put on TTXs. And additionally, like I keep telling Phil, this is the millennial plug. We recognize each other's specialties and know that. So Phil knows I come from an East Asia background. So whenever we have to deal with East Asia security dynamics or scenarios, he points people just directly to me. And so rather than having to figure it out, what people are talking about when they talk about, say, PLA Navy dynamics, he just says, go talk to Lexee, and I can handle that within a matter of minutes. So one aspect of this is knowing each other, right? So I would just recommend do that. And then also recognizing one another, right? So when Phil designs a game, I say, Phil designs a game. If I actually manage to design a game, Phil says, Lexee designed this game. You're shaking your head, but I feel like there's been about 1 instance of that. But everything boils down to 3. Oh man, thank you for keeping count for me. But everything boils down to giving each other recognition, having a good sense of humility. None of us is married to any sort of game design or game idea. And when we go into these brainstorming sessions, that really shines through, right? So you'll hear me pitch the same idea, or you'll hear me play devil's advocate just to shoot ideas down, but nobody's butthurt, has hurt feelings about it, because nobody's married to a single idea. We're here to answer the question, answer the sponsor ask, and put something out as quickly as possible. That being said, everyone is respectful in discourse. So we don't talk about things that, you know, are sources of problems. Like, you know, I'm not even gonna mention them, but yes, so we are respectful in discourse, have humility, and like to give each other praise and recognition. So that being said, I'm gonna move along to how, because this is kind of like the touchy-feely part of Agile Gaming. Our next slide is gonna be about facilitating. So a large part of what I do here on the team is not just red teaming and scenario development. That's kind of how I got started here on the team, and where I've found my niche, but a lot of it now is just doing this facilitation. So just real quickly in the chat, and everyone can see the picture there, I just want somebody to post, or multiple people post, how recently, could be yesterday, it could be today, it could be this Zoom, but were you in a Zoom and you did not feel engaged? And if you were not engaged, how many people were talking in that Zoom session or team session? Oh man, I'm not doing, oh, okay, last Tuesday, a few days ago, today. Wow. Every day. Right, Zoom fatigue is real. Zoom fatigue is real. Definitely in this COVID environment, we have seen a lot more meetings and a lot more of this screen-to-screen time than we would if we were in person and everything. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Paviano. Oh, awesome. So definitely, if there's 3 out of 18 people talking during a workshop, that is not the best facilitation. What we try to do is, like 18 to me sounds too many. I think we had a group of 20 people who wanted to play a game, and this was actually, I think, a 10-game series. That's what we did for Homeland. And we just split everyone up. We said, this is too many. We want people to interact with the material. People should be filling out their portions of the tool we were using. And, you know, because there's 5 to 6 of us at any given time who are available to help with a game, and it's virtual, everyone just kind of hosted their own Teams meeting in their own Teams room. And that not only allows us as the white cell to interact more with our players and our participants, but also allows them to interact more with each other. So a big part of this is knowing your audience, right? There's been a few instances in which I'll self-admit, have lost control of our guest list or attendee list, and it just has not worked best for the dynamics. So a lot of the conversations that Phil and I and in our team at large have are around the game designs and the objectives, and then what types of personalities, expertise could help or impede that game or that game design. A lot of times there's a very specific subject, particularly when you're working with government clients, that has 2 sides of the story. And sometimes you're going to get the most honest opinion when the sides mix, and sometimes you're going to get the most honest opinions when they're kept separate. And just kind of recognizing that and recognizing some of the cultural biases, some of the preferences, can really help you have a successful game and get you to the objectives that you have. So I will pause here very briefly, but before that, or after that, I'm going to go into a story, mainly because I'm thirsty and still semi-sick. Okay, so a really good example of game development and playing the room is actually the series we have already talked about, where we had to turn it out in 4 days. We had a former DepSecDef, we had lots of operators, subject matter experts, and a lot of people who were just there to check their box and do a lot of talking. And it made it really difficult for some of the subject matter experts who were there to share their opinions, to share their views, and the subject matter experts were really supposed to be the goal of this game. What that ended up doing for us is not only did we change the structure of that game, but we also had a very clear and honest conversation with the sponsor about game attendees, and got that list down from 20 people all trying to fight for having a say in the game down to 8. And that really helped us within the structure that we were operating. So that being said, everything we do not only allows for better discourse, but better success of the game. And so it's not just about reading the room and doing your research on who's coming and what your game design is, but it's knowing how they should interact and play off of each other. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. If anyone has read Sun Tzu in their 500 class yet, know thy enemy, understand them, and then get to it. So that's kind of what when I was writing the slide, I was like, oh man, I should mention that. My professors would be so happy. I'm going to talk about COVID transition a little bit, and then I'm going to let Phil talk about it a little bit, because we have kind of two sides of the story. But basically how this went down is March 13th was the second game in a 3-game series. And then after that, we went home and did not return to the office for the foreseeable future. So we had about 2 to 3 gaming series, because I don't know if Phil has mentioned this, but we run a lot of TTXs or tabletop exercises in 3 to 4 series, where we take only 3 to 4 hours on 2 consecutive days, etc., for people to devote their time. But we had 2 to 3 of these series that were running and mid-series, and then were just canceled. So because of the pandemic and the transition to telework, we couldn't work on some of those higher fidelity games that we were doing. So we had to transition to some of these lower fidelity, lower complexity games and models. And I'll just go back to these brainstorming sessions and this kind of flat idea sphere that we've created, where we took a moment, we took a breather to talk about what some of our concerns were regarding the COVID pandemic. And then we determined some things that we could do in the meantime, just sitting down in our homes that we're not high stress, but we're still getting the ball moving. The 3 things that came out of that were developing some notional scenarios, looking at the software and tools that we had available to transition to doing games virtually, because previously all of our games had been in person, and then identifying some of the key stakeholders that we had been talking to, particularly ones who had their gaming series canceled or had told us ideas that may not come to fruition due to the COVID crisis. So since then, we've run about 12 to 14 virtual TTXs. I think we have about 3 to 4 more on the books. We like to stay busy, but because we only run 2-hour games, we're not running super long into other people's times. So Phil, I'm going to get you the chance to comment on this transition.
Thank you, Lexi. So the big change for me is coming from the background that I did. It's almost exclusively tabletop games in one way or another, whether it's a board game, a card game, a command post exercise where you look at a map. A rock drill is functionally just a scaled up board game. Going to something where they're like, okay, board games, but step 1, no board, because we can't touch it, was definitely a culture shock. Now, not totally. In my private capacity, I've played with things like Tabletop Simulator or Vassal, but I stand no chance in being able to have time to teach O4s how either of those systems work, because intuitive is not how I would describe them. Learnable and logical, yes, I think they're good systems, but easy to just pick up with no context, no. So we were asked to look at how could you make things that people could easily see, and how could you make them that they were interactive. And because we work for defense, and defense likes certain things, we started with PowerPoint, which was a good starting point and a good ad hoc sort of let's cook things up in March. But the longer we've gone on, the more we've looked at more and more different opportunities for what can people look at. What I can say about the design process and how it changed is the emphasis went away from one shared picture that everybody sees and went towards how do you make sure everybody has the information they need. That sounds kind of like, wait a second, Phil, aren't those the same thing? Well, no, because traditionally it's easy to figure out who needs who gets the information, because you can look around the room and see who's confused. You could see who's not talking. You could see who's kind of nodding to each other and going, hey, where's my card for this? I should have a card for this. And the facilitator can go over and help that person. In a digital format, that's not just difficult. Sometimes it's impossible. I mean, I'm sure some of you guys with the cameras and mics off right now are all tabbed surfing the internet or playing video games or whatever. I have no way of knowing. So it becomes much more difficult for checking in and making sure, are you paying attention to all the pieces? And this means the overlap between design and facilitation has to be huge. I had to show Lexee, here's what every single piece means that could go on the map. Here's how it could be used. Here's how it'll be good. Here's what you need to check on. If you don't get this, ask this question. And vice versa, she would point out, hey, this makes no sense. If you don't justify this, nobody's going to pay attention. So that is a lot of talking to say that basically the dynamics changed, but they weren't irreversible. They weren't unbeatable. Our first go-arounds were a little rough around the edges, but thanks to some ingenuity from Doc Walrab, one of our other team members, he came up with a longer-term way to run distributed ops that we utilize throughout COVID that's been incredibly handy. And honestly, it's boring, but the process matters. When people understand how to get online and which team's room to go to and which room is for briefings and which room is their breakout room, things get quicker and things get smoother. So a lot of rambling, but hopefully that made sense. Told you guys how we transition to COVID environment. Back to you, Lexee.
No, that's a really great point, because I'm in the room and when I'm facilitating a session, I just want people to argue and have the very strong discourse and get those emotions out and feel, if they are really into the missile system, I want them to tell me. But when all I see is their little bubble of a head, I don't know what they're thinking or feeling. I can't read their body language. And so this has been a lot of trial and error, guys. Like, this is not down to science by any means, but Phil does have a point about PowerPoint. I'm sorry that you had to build that 5,000 hex map on PowerPoint. Thank you for that, though.
Yeah, if you guys are looking for lessons learned, don't build maps on PowerPoint.
That's a really good transition to our failures just lessons slide, though, Phil, because we didn't fail at anything. We just learned a lesson. So Agile Gaming is really great because even if we don't get to 100% solution, we get somewhere, right? So sacrifice perfection, which is really difficult for me and our team leader, Ian, who we may have some OCD about things being perfect and perfectly aligned, but sacrificing perfection means you get to good enough, and good enough is better than what you had before. So it's okay for things to not go as predicted, particularly at your gaming event, and it's okay to change things up even at your gaming event, even right after, just to meet the goals and the objectives and to get just even closer to that 100% solution. So in talking with one of our government clients, he mentioned, for us, an A+ is going to be that 60 to, I jokingly said 62% solution. And we'll go to that on the next slide. But if everyone knows what I'm talking about, I'd be remiss if I did not mention the Great British Bake Off down below. So very clearly you see that cake is about to topple. And a lot of times our games seem like they're about to collapse, but it's probably because one thing is wrong. And in the cake, in the British Bake Off tent, the one thing that could be wrong could be you used white chocolate or it's too hot. So sometimes things are just out of your control. And so us not being married to any sort of game really helps us not only get over ourselves, but just adapt to the conditions that have changed. Yes, Stephen, the cake still tasted good. And believe it or not, the woman who made that cake made it to the finals of that season. So there's a lesson in everything. This is you, Phil.
Terrific. So is an Agile game for you? Or does the problem that you're currently looking at, could it benefit from Agile game? I'm going to give the typical consultant answer that everybody hates. It depends. But it really does. Our games are low fidelity. They are not good at getting to 100% of questions, let alone answers. If you come to our team and say, we need to know the definitive way to beat adversary X in a fight in 2025, I'm going to look at you and give you the name of somebody reputable to go talk to them about it, because our team can't do that. We can't provide you a conclusive answer on that. But if instead you say, what would it be like to test system Y against adversary X? Well, that we can build you a framework for, and that we can talk about. So a lot of folks that we talk with, they start with very abstract concepts. And many times they're not actually looking for 100% of an answer. They're looking for a starting point or a refined research questions. They need something because what they're dealing with is so immensely complex. It is not easy to get to any kind of an answer, and they need to know where to start. I'll give you an example. Let's say we have an adversary out there that's developed a type of missile. We'll call it the base deleter missile. And the base deleter missile can delete every US air base within an X radius. The Air Force is concerned about what to do about the base deleter missile. But what's the answer? Is it to abandon air bases entirely and run everything VTOL? Is it to develop base defense systems? Is it to develop ways to counter these missiles through electronic countermeasures or cyber attacks? Is it to develop our space infrastructure so we always know where the base deleters are and we know exactly how to react to them? Is it to invest in innovative technologies that would make it that even if you destroy the runway, we have a new runway grown biologically in 12 hours? Any of these things are conceivable answers, but no one of them is the answer. All of them deserve some kind of exploration if they have an advocate saying, I want to know more about this, or I want to know what this does. And that's just on the scientific end. Once you get that, you have to talk about operationally, because a scientific achievement that operators can't or won't use is not useful. If you don't believe me, check out how beyond visual range missiles were used, or more appropriately, not used by a lot of folks that were coming out of Vietnam. They had a different experience with missiles. They didn't want to trust beyond visual range because a lot of the early generation IR missiles weren't very accurate. They put the miss in missile, as the saying went at the time. So you have to get operators to trust the technology and trust the solutions. So if you don't have that, you're never going to get anywhere. But most of our folks, they have to start with paring down what that is that they even have. So the last thing, if the concept is strictly scientific and does not involve human or human-like, in the case of AI inputs, such as command decisions, the game is likely not the best fit. A model will be able to answer such questions much better. What I mean by that is I could make a game about missile intercepts. Like I could make a game where you plot the chart of a cruise missile going in on a very dangerous strike, and it would be probably fun for me because I like that stuff, boring for most people. And honestly, it would tell you maybe 1/10 of what you could get out of an entry-level model on the same subject. When you start dealing with math and numbers and want to refine probability of kill or other systems, use a model. There's no need to use a game. What we are good at providing at is model inputs. So using my missile example, what our games might tell us is what types of missiles the operators prefer. And then we can give to the modeling people and say, hey, so far you're spending 3 hours every day on missile X and only 1 hour on missile Y, but operators really want to talk about missile Y. Can you put more emphasis on modeling that missile? And the M&S people, they grumble a little bit because nobody likes being told what you're doing isn't ideal, but they help us. And in return, we work together with them to get those outputs to the clients. So I think that's about it on this slide. And with that, we get to our question session.
Yeah, so Phil, I think our first question that remains unanswered, I'm going to take it. It's from Ryan Lee about how a facilitator can seek to incorporate or address biases, and I'm guessing this is institutional and personal biases, and their effects on games without limiting unique perspectives that bring to wargaming. So this is a really good point because in a larger game, if you're playing for 10 to 14 days, you have the opportunity to see how people's biases may affect their decisions. When we only have people in a room for 2 hours, and we have them doing a very shortened task list, or in Phil's example, you are just looking at cruise missiles. You are just looking at the effects of base deleter, or what you would want to do as that theater commander to deal with a base deleter attack, right? If people want to raise their hand and say, well, I don't believe base deleter exists, they're missing the scope and the objective of the game. And that, to me, great. I understand you have your opinions, but there's not a place for that in this game. And we're really only asking people for 2 hours of their time, but it's 2 hours of intense focus time where, if you, like Phil mentioned, we sometimes meet with participants 2 to 3 times before their actual game day so that they have pressed the I believe button. So if you come to the Based Leader game and you don't believe in the Based Leader missile, it's probably not the best use of your time and then the people around you's times. So how I deal with those biases is you don't come into the game if you don't believe in the thing that we're talking about. Yeah, I know that's a little harsh, but nobody wants more meetings.
The only thing I would add is if we do get folks that don't like what we're briefing, we note the dissent in the report, and we tell them that. And then we ask them in not so many words to shut the hell up and let everybody else play. We're more diplomatic about it. Lexee probably has many more syllables that don't sound as crude, but I'm from the Army and I speak crude.
Yeah. So Phil, I think the next question is kind of in your wheelhouse about getting, I'm going to rephrase this from Stephen about senior officers and civilian execs to learn game rules instead of participating in their day-to-day role. This is kind of your wheelhouse of role-playing games. So can you talk about how you design a game around getting people out of their day-to-day mindset and into a different role?
Yeah, absolutely. So to me, I think there's 3 things involved, and I will do them in descending order of importance. So the most important thing is, what kind of personalities do you have involved? If you have a very strong personality that is not willing to learn games and really just wants an opportunity to talk, believe it or not, we're okay with that. We don't mind providing workshops or other such symposiums to try to help people talk out their ideas. But we also don't want to burn valuable daylight on a game design if we don't think somebody's going to use it. So when we gauge with what kind of personality we're working with and how easy is it going to get them to game, it's exactly what Lexee's talking about. We get a sense of, will they believe, will they press the button? One thing that differentiates us from a lot of other wargamers and a lot of people in ops research and modeling and sim as well is this job really requires you to be an extrovert. You have to be good with talking to people, and you have to be good with making friends and refining sort of what do people want and why do they want it, because otherwise you get that exact phenomenon where you get someone that essentially won't step out of what they're doing right now to try to play this game or to learn this. And we're not 100% successful. There's at least one person at one MAGCOM who will go nameless who has described our games as, quote, completely worthless because this person could not be bothered to buy into why does the game system work. We don't let that bother us. It doesn't keep us awake at night. The nature of any kind of a game or any kind of a model is that they're not perfect. We just want them to be useful. And we do believe they are useful. So the second thing after personality is ease of design. If I have to spend less time teaching you, it's more likely you're going to buy off. If you've ever learned a game with a friend and the friend has to stop every 5 seconds to flip through the rules, find out what the right rule is, go back, tell you, oh, nope, turns out that's not the right rule. That was an only exception. It gets very tedious very quickly. The less rules you have to teach, the easier it will be to teach people. So a simple design, which is what we favor, is more likely to work. Now, if you can't do that, if a simple design is out of the wheelhouse, what you're trying to do is too complex, you have to make it user-friendly in other ways. That may be a way that you do all the work as the facilitator. So the example that I will give for that is in the TV show Community. They have 2 different episodes focused around Dungeons and Dragons. Both of those episodes are not played like a traditional D&D game. In traditional Dungeons & Dragons, each player rolls their own dice for each of their own actions. In the Community episode, in order to keep it on TV and to keep it moving, they just have Abed, who's playing the role of Dungeon Master, roll the dice all the time. You could do something similar here. If you don't want to try to teach people rules, you can have your facilitators and your adjudicators as the gates, and they will be the ones rolling the dice. They will be the ones manipulating the game system. This takes the load off the players, and it means all you have to do is tell the facilitator what you want, and the facilitator will translate that or communicate that into game terms. Now, where that can get funky is that if the facilitator is not 100% sure what all this stuff is, the players may pitch an unusual TTP that the game design doesn't allow for. When that happens, that takes some on-your-feet adjustment, and it's not unbeatable, but it is something you have to be aware of. So the third and final thing is control of the room. So with control of the room, this is something that Lexee and Ian excel at. People have to have to understand that when you're running a game, it cannot be disputed control. It cannot be whose turn is it to talk. It cannot be everybody shouting everywhere. That won't work well. So if you have somebody that won't play the rules and they're disrupting the game, you do the exact move I talk about where you say, hey, sir, we understand that you don't think this is useful. We're going to note your dissent in the report, and we do screen this by them so they make sure their dissent gets taken seriously and they get to read what we think they said. But once that's done, it's it. They either play along or we ask them to leave. We have never had to ask a player to leave. We have had to blacklist players. We've had people that were disruptive enough that we have a list. It's a short list, but it says people that don't attend Fox's games because they can't be trusted to play by the rules. So that was probably about 4,000 words more than you wanted on that, but did I answer your question?
I think you've answered it, Phil. So the next question in the general chat, well, I kind of took over for Grant in my typical fashion, and he sends me the rest of your guys' questions. Next question is about when do we pivot? And I think we have pivoted an entire game design after the conclusion of a game, and I think we've pivoted game components in the midst of the game. And so the pivot of entire game design, Phil and I and one of our government clients / sponsors on the line right now, we're running a game, and it was really well designed. It just was not meeting the objectives and was not meeting the asks of what it needed to. And so that's that game that we've talked about, where we just re-examined, and we ended up having to insert a little more capabilities and a little more tactical focus than we had originally anticipated. And then 4 days, including some weekend days later, we turned it around, had a whole new game design for the next in that series on the following week, and we're ready to go. We've also pivoted in the middle of the game. So particularly with this COVID transition, there's various levels of comfort with the tools, virtual tools, teams, et cetera, that have been provided. And so when running one of our virtual games, we noticed that people were having a little difficulty not only accessing the team's rooms or chats, but using the tool that we had provided for them for the purposes of gaming. And so instead of having them do it themselves, we just on the spot pivoted to me doing it, me showing them how to do it. And rather than it being due within an hour, we gave them 3 days. So that was just me sending a quick side chat, I think even a text to Phil and Ian, and saying, hey, this is what we're going to do, because it just seems like they're not getting it. So yeah, I think anywhere from 5 minutes to 4 days, we pivot our games. So next question, I'm going to go on to a step-by-step design process for a quick game. Yeah, Phil, do you want to go from when you receive a new concept to when you, and fictionally?
Certainly. So I won't go in too much detail here. We do have some proprietary information to hide. We have to keep our trade intact somehow. But in broad strokes terms, we go from the first thing that happens is we get person X is interested. Person X is from an organization either internal to AFWIC or external with an AFWIC sponsor. We talk to that person about you're interested in this concept, so then we look at would a game be right from you. If we determine that a game is right for them, that starts our turnaround cycle. Once we determine a game is right for them, we like to set out a schedule for sort of, are we going to be able to play test this with you? Are we going to be able to talk to the types of people we need? We conduct research for the first step, where usually we divide up the team, and it might look like something like this. Like in a game, it might go, okay, Doc, you have first chair game design, I have second chair game design. Lexee, you have first chair facilitation, Ian has second chair facilitation. Owen, you're conducting a model based around X, and we'll spend the next 2 or 3 days researching the topic. Research can include both classified and unclassified research. It can include interviews. It can include sort of trying to figure out how this has already been replicated in existing games. All of these are examples of research. Once we have sufficient research, we begin a design. The design is usually something that we have at least immediate group consensus on. Let's try. To quote Ian, it's usually something I pick out that's entirely too complicated. So Lexee and Ian rip the guts out of it, take away 2/3 of it, and the remaining third is better. All writers need editors for a reason. And That remaining streamlined third we have, we then take that back to the client and say, hey, we're thinking something like this, but there is some design lift. Is this what you like or no? This gives the client an opportunity to say, yes, we do like this, or no, you've gone in the wrong direction. If they approve it, we start the design lift. So once the design lift has gone through, there's 2 phases of testing. There is dev testing that's usually conducted by myself and Doc as the game designers, where we kind of talk through and go, does this work? Does that work? Oh no, you broke the game. Wait, this isn't anything like reality. And we put it together. Once we've got that, we elevate to play testing. If you want to think of it in software terms, it's alpha and beta, respectively. Where play testing, we get people that weren't involved in development to start taking a look at it and see if they can break it. Usually it's a mix of internal play tests. We have Lexee, Owen, and Ian, and external play tests, usually government side sponsors. Once we've got that done, if possible, we schedule a formal play test with the person we went with, but if that's not possible, we move straight to execution. So that sounds like a lot, and it is, but it's one of the reasons we try to keep games simple and streamlined. The people that play tested the game of War, built out of a 52 card deck, had a much easier time than the poor SOBs that play tested Campaign for North Africa.
Yeah, so a lot of testing and a lot of discourse between us. What Phil's referring to, I don't take away his game, but it is the Candyland test where I, as the facilitator, say, hey, I'm gonna need to be able to explain this in not gamey terms, so people know what they're holding and know that licorice man is bad. So next question actually comes from Sebastian. Hi, Sebastian. Why does AFWIC use the agile method over other types of war games? This is like kind of a common misconception. We have nothing to do with the lean agile method, other than we know it's very cool and very buzzwordy. But we do work in concert with other types of war games. So AFWIC uses our team doing agile games. They use the Wolves. I think you have Mitch Reed and Craig on the line to do Title 10 gaming. And then they also work with other external organizations to do different types of games, including Matrix, Seminar, model-based gaming, all the way up to functional exercises to get their concepts or capabilities where they need to be. So we just happen to be embedded in there, and that's just kind of how it worked out. But yeah, I hopefully that answers your question. I don't have a strict why, but they do a lot of stuff. Hi, Frank. When you are crafting a game to answer a specific question, how often does that question change through the process of creating the game? This is through a lot of that back and forth process. So I think a really good example of this is actually the first game that we tried to run. Phil, if you remember all the use cases and if you want to talk about that, but we pretty much killed 75% of use cases. I'll let Phil talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so Lexi already spoiled it, and that's definitely the important part. But the short answer is, I don't create these games for my health. I don't create these games so I, Phil, can have fun. If I did, it would be endless renditions of Imperial Japan mixed with cruise missiles, and nobody would play that except me. But we make games ultimately for our clients, which means that if they feel the questions that we're addressing or the objectives we're after are not actually suiting their needs, we will modify them. If we find that players aren't going to be able to address those objectives through the game, like we set up an objective that initially we think the game will address, and it turns out the game doesn't really address that at all, we adjust it. A good example there I'll give, as anybody in defense is familiar with, is the difficulties of Paul Mill. We assume any number of games we have will address Paul Mill concerns, and we get surprised. There's games that we're positive that would address Paul Mill concerns. I mean, come on, they have to. You're talking about working with green forces. And the players shy away from that and say, no, sir, I don't want to talk about that, not my lane, and we scrub it out of the game. There's other games that we didn't think would touch on Paul Mill at all that we have somebody that insists, like, hey, you got to play Paul Mill here. So we modify it as many times as necessary to continue towards our goals of refining the question or getting an answer that we originally set out to get. So that was, I hope that answers the question. I know it's another consultant, it depends answer, but such is life.
The next question is for you too, Phil. So I'll stall if you need to get a sip of water because this is a lot and you're gonna like this. So, are Agile games applicable to both seminar and matrix style games? From Kathy Welch.
I think so. Yes, I think we lend ourselves best to not a particular type of game, but a particular type of outcome, which is again that 60% solution, which may be best addressed through a seminar. It may be best addressed through a matrix game where people get to argue their case. It may be addressed best through a simple board game or simple card game that really just generates conversation. I don't think there's any one style favored by this, because I think it mostly depends on the clients we work with. We had one set of clients that the quote unquote game they liked was basically just an interactive model. The game elements of it were very minimal. You moved a point around in the model and 3 points attached to it moved with. By contrast, we've had other folks that we've been able to help them without having a game. We just had a series of workshops and that was enough for them. So I think it's important where if you want to be an Agile gamer, you have to keep your mind open to any kind of system that could work and adapt it to the client at hand.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. From Rob about books in particular that we would recommend, we're going to put our brains to it, and we will type in the chat as each of us are talking what we can recommend. I know Phil's going to say like the classics on War, Bennett Cafferty, Peter Perler's Art of Wargaming, but more specifically for what we do when we consider future force designs. I want to say about 2 years ago, Phil made me read Ghost Fleet. I used to read on the mark a lot, so it was fine. But when he explains things or catastrophes or injects for games, a lot of times he'll refer that to me because it's something we have in common. So if you want a common future, future warfare type of scenario, that's always a good one to talk about with your folks. And then I have from Josh, could you please describe your typical, or I'm not sure if you mean just analytical outputs, but Josh, I'm going to answer you this with another, it depends. Sometimes our outputs are just inputs for a model, right? So a model can't have too many inputs or won't run. Or the inputs for a model could not be as well thought out, but sometimes it's just layers of insights. So we had a gaming series that was very tactically based, but what came out of that and what we abstracted out of the decisions that players made within that gaming series was a lot of the decisions they were making had strategic implications. And so we noted the strategic implications and then said, hey, here are the decisions that tactically your operators are making and how you have to factor it in at that higher, theater commander or strategic level. So typical outputs is a report that could say numbers, it could say words. We're not really beholden to any one template. I think Phil would agree here. So
Yes, basically entirely. The only thing I would add is that in terms of analytical outputs, one thing we always do is make some sort of a report. It may be a white paper, it may be a set of slides, but it is something that captures at least the qualitative conversation that happened during the game at a minimum. Maximum, way too much to describe here, but understand that any good game is underpinned by good data capture, and that's all I'll say on that.
So the next question is for us both, and we'll go in alphabetical order. So Phil, you will answer first. How have commercial games affected your ability to craft agile games?
The short answer is they got me this job. Something that's important to consider is that the average age of a field grade officer right now is in their mid-30s, which means that one way or the other, they grew up with gaming. They grew up playing things like GoldenEye on Nintendo 64 or Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo, or any number of other games on any number of other systems. they have in their mind what a game is, and this differentiates them from folks in the generation ahead of them. Well, maybe not the generation immediately ahead of them, but the generation that tends to be at the top of the field grade, or the general officer chart above the field grades. What this means and why this is important is whenever you're speaking in game language, you want to use language that people understand. The more commercial games you played, the more likely it is that you speak a compatible language with them. The average player may not understand what a zone of control is. They may not understand what a combat resolution table is, but they understand what a game is. So you have to bridge that gap. I think the biggest thing that I learned from commercial gaming that I take everywhere I go is that quality matters. And that may seem like, wait, really? Duh, Phil. No, 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 hear me out. When I say quality matters, what I mean is that if you want people to pay attention, your stuff has to look good. Doesn't have to be beautiful, but it has to look professional. It has to be smooth. You can't have, oh, wow, I didn't know it would do that as one of your answers on game day. You have to test. It's one of the reasons why we're obsessed with testing. We don't like surprises or oh snaps on game day related to the game design broke down or something happened that should not be able to happen in real life. So if you make sure that all your leaks are filled and that your game runs smooth, you're going to have a good time. And that's true with commercial game design as well. So what about you, Lexi?
So I think I'm a little harsher because I like when things fail in testing, and I'm like, wait a second, you said this would work just like Thunderbolt Apache Leader, and it's not working. And then we have to re-examine it. I think that's great, and it's a really good part of the learning process for us as a team. Commercial gaming for me is a little more specific because I did not come from a big hobby gaming background. I came from like this policy strategy down to like military operations background. So when I look at how that should function in gaming, specifically wargaming, it really helps for me to have mechanics from one game. And so I don't know if anyone saw on my slide, there's a game called XCOM. And I personally am not great at it, right? Like I'm not great at it, but I understand how it works. And how it works is like you build this post-apocalyptic world. You have your teams that go out and do different things. Your teams have to like repopulate themselves. So when we were looking at, like a homeland defense type of scenario, it feels like, no, you have to reconstitute your troops. And I think we were playing Fortress America. And I was like, wait a second, I understand this because these guys can't go all the way here from their base. You have to have Ohio have its own troops. And which seems logical, but when you're looking at, like I said, I'm an SSPer, when your entire academic background is focusing on this high-level international strategy, it really helps to have these mechanics in your backliner that you can refer to when you play either operational or tactical games. So that's where it's been a lot very beneficial to me. And I'll go ahead and take the next question from Greg T. And then Dean, I saw your hand was raised. So speaking of commercial off-the-shelf games, what is your first step out game now, i.e. like the baby game? For me, in terms of like war games, Thunderbolt Apache Leader was the first one that Phil put in front of me, but I think, and I'm not going to speak for you, so either concur or not concur, he would have given me Twilight Struggle first, if he could have.
Yeah, I think it depends on what you're trying to learn. I gave Lexi Thunderbolt Apache because if you're trying to talk about strike and close air support, that's one of the best. It's a Dan Verson Games design. It's not 100% realistic. You get control of a squadron that magically has Army, Air Force, and Marine air units, and man, I wish they worked together that nicely in real life. But in terms of learning the basics for how does close air support work and how does general purpose combat aviation, I was told the acronym changed since I got out of the Army. And it's a good one to look at. But I do agree with Lexi. Overall, I would say Twilight Struggle, which honestly, if you're starting tactically, that may not be good. But in terms of solid game design, it may not be the best game, but it's pretty darn close. Maybe 5% off from perfect max. But it's just a very smooth playing game, even though it's a Cold War strategic game, which for your lieutenants may not seem useful. Just in terms of learning the game, it will. Now that said, knowing what you do for a living, Greg, I have some other ideas when we're not online. Just bug me and I'll write you. And to address Brian's question, yes, Thunderbolt Apache is a solitaire game, which is one of the interesting things about it. You only need yourself to play. I will add, though, if you want to talk about design, all solitaire games are inherently cooperative. The only difference is who's controlling what cards. So if you want to play a team game instead with Thunderbolt Apache, you just assign each person one pilot. It doesn't work that great. I've tried it, but it does work.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I had no idea what cooperative versus competitive games were until I started playing them, and it felt like, no, that's a cooperative game. It's like, I see, that makes sense. So like, hence why I like playing games with my significant other, where we're taking on a bad guy together. It makes me feel like we are cooperating. So Kate, you have a really good question about multiple a game exploring multiple questions or concepts. Sometimes, there is a broad concept that has a lot of variables in it. And so, missile defense, for example, just going back to our base to leader example, is a really good, is very tantamount of that, right? So you have a lot of different factors, not just from the physical side of things, but also from your strategy and your operations. And so when we would look at the base to leader example, we would say, hey, like, let's look at these bases, and you have decisions around which bases to look at. And then you also have decisions about what type of defenses you have, or what makes people press the I believe button. So there's a lot of different variables that go into some games. I wouldn't say a whole bunch of questions, because pretty much questions are trying to shape the objective and how you're thinking about things and how you're driving. So Frank, your question is actually our next slide. So I'm going to get to the last two questions before we get to is gaming. Why is gaming fun? Should gaming be fun? Etc. So the second to last question is, how is the fidelity of a game determined or measured? So I don't know where Phil went, but a really good example of this is when you're talking about close air support or some sort of airstrike game. You have your level of detail on your token. So Thunderbolt Apache Leader was one of my first introductions into wargaming, and you have pilots, you have tokens, but then you have a generic terrain. So that is a higher fidelity game, except for your terrain being these hexes that kind of move around. But your tokens and your pilots are very, very detailed. So we have a question about how to determine the fidelity of a game, or how to measure the fidelity of a game. I use Thunderbolt Apache Leader as a example of something that's kind of like medium high fidelity. How would you measure a low fidelity versus a high fidelity game on the same thing?
The quick and easy description I'll give you is low fidelity is 16-bit and high fidelity is 4K HD. So if I have to draw a little helicopter for Desert Strike that looks kind of like a helicopter, it makes vaguely helicopter-ish noises as it thwups through the air. It has missiles and rockets that it can launch, but they're really just little pixels, and they don't actually have a defined range. They just kind of travel off in a direction and explode for a certain amount of damage points. By contrast, a 4D look at the same thing would be Jane's Apache Longbow, and ideally one with the absolute modern up-to-date graphics and the best modeling possible for every single missile systems on it. Something like that would be the high fidelity equivalent. In terms of measurements, I think you have to measure each individual game for what is it replicating. I know it's another it depends, but I swear it really does. Nuance is your friend if you're going to go into this business. Some games representing some things, you can get one-to-one fidelity. If I wanted to look at what does a poker game play like with 5 people, I play poker with 5 people, one-to-one fidelity. If I want to know what does the Treaty of Versailles look like, I play Versailles 1919, but the real Treaty of Versailles was signed by a bunch of people. It was signed by some representatives that each represented giant governments, that each had people that researched, each had lobbyists in their own individual interests. There were third parties that influenced it. And the game does what it can to represent that. But because it can't do one-to-one, it is not 100% fidelity. So did that answer your question?
I think it does. I think my simple Candyland explanation would be your low fidelity game is your like chocolate chip cookie, and then your high fidelity game is your vanilla cake with like edible chocolate chip cookie dough and vanilla buttercream and chocolate drizzle. Just more things going on, but you're still eating something that tastes like a chocolate chip cookie. Not that I want cookies.
I got to interject because I noticed you glossed over it because it was Mitch's soft layup attempt, but I really do think, could you tell the story about what happened with Futures 20? Because it was an important moment of facilitation that you did that I think people here would like to hear.
What part?
So I'm thinking the problem with people not talking to each other, incompatible systems.
Yeah. So when you have things that are remote and distributed, and particularly people that don't get a lot of face time with one another, there is a propensity to just think, hey, how I'm doing this is how I've done it before, and this is just how I'm going to do it because this is the right way to do it, etc. And what actually ended up happening is, as things were changing on the ground with this larger war game, messages either weren't being received or internalized, or whatever happened. There was some sort of miscommunication between the headquarters white cell and some outstation white cells in regards specifically to what classification materials need to be submitted at. So going through that and trying to talk people through, like, hey, what are you actually doing? What are your moves? What are you trying to accomplish here? And then being told, like, oh no, we can't tell you because we don't have it, because it's not here with us in the room, because it's at a different classification level, after I asked them 1,000 questions. That's kind of a big deal, because then you can't go brief the other team. So if you can't tell your white cell what you're doing, the white cell can't tell the other team what you're doing. And I get it, we have these different intelligence apparatus, et cetera, but no game is completely blind, right? No war game is completely blind. And, a really good example of this is whenever you're playing a board game with people, they can see your moves. And granted, when things are distributed, people, are just not going to see all of your moves that you're making on your board or your virtual board or your common operating picture in this case. So kind of bridging that gap just required, we'll call it facilitation, but pretty much just me asking a lot of questions and asking things to be explained to me in Candyland terms. So this is just an example of, hey, I'm kind of the blind guy in the room, and on the team, Phil talks about all these commercial games, but if I come in and I don't understand the game design or understand what's happening, there's needs to be something more happening there. So Dean, I feel like you have a very large development question. I'm going to save you to the end because I would like to get to Frank's question, because it is Phil's next slide that he really wants to talk about, called Should Wargaming Be Fun? So thank you for that setup, Frank.
We did not plan that ahead of time, he and I, but we could have, because this was my bonus slides in the event we got done with everything. So this is one of my pet issues. It's related to Agile Wargaming, but it's not. And it's one of the age-old questions of, should wargaming be fun? And the answer really seems obvious. Of course, everything should be fun, right? That's how you keep people engaged. But fun's not our objective. As mentioned earlier, if I was designing games strictly for fun, I would be in a different industry. It's one parallel to this one, and it's one that I consume a lot of, and it's one that I even participate in to an extent. But it's a little bit different. Fun with that bulldozes, obscures, or denies our learning goals is inherently counterproductive. So it's a balancing act, but it's also a, can you make this happen? Some learning goals are boring. We're going we're going through not one but two different games about bureaucracy. It is exceptionally difficult to make a game about bureaucracy fun. It's not impossible. I see Frank in the comments talking about Papers, Please. Yeah, Papers, Please is a lot of fun. I don't see any version where I could get that for a GS-15 and have them look at me seriously. So I have to balance that, and you have to look at, again, what are the individual demands. So what is this balance if I keep talking about it? I think there's a few core parts of it, but the three that I have that I think are related to fun are best described here. What distinguishes your game from other ways players learn? If all this was about raw learning, I could retire safely into my writer's corner, do nothing but what nonfiction and white papers for the rest of my life, and make a lot of money from the Department of Defense. But what did the Department of Defense learn about white papers? They don't get read. And it's not because defense officials are stupid or mean or hate you for writing. It is because they're busy. And it is because with everything else they have, the idea of reading somewhere between 2,000 and 50,000 words on a given topic is not in their daily business. So when you take something like this, it is a way to get it in their daily business. Do you want the same players to play again? If you do, I'd suggest that your game is fun, because it's easy to get people to come to you for 4 hours for learning. Some of the same people will come to another 4 hours if they're really dedicated, if it's, you know, something that's in their bailiwick or they really need answers to for the purposes of their job. But if you want the widest possible audience, a fun game is more likely to get repeat players. If you play a fun game, you're more likely to say, I really enjoyed that. It was a nice welcome break from all these other terrible meetings I've had all day. It was a nice welcome break from everything else I've had to do with the bureaucracy. And you can kind of condition your players to see this as a reprieve. For people working in the Pentagon, that's a big deal. I don't know how many folks on here are former military or current military, but the Pentagon is in a lot of places considered like a death assignment. Like if you follow the cartoon artist Doctrine Man on Facebook, half of his jokes are "Ha the Pentagon sucks," and he's not wrong. It's unpleasant to work at. It's very high stress. If you're there as a major, you're basically getting people's coffee. If you're there as a lieutenant colonel, you've upgraded from having to get coffee to now you just have to get sandwiches. But it's a place where everybody outranks you and the stress is on all the time. So if this is something that can stand out as not stressful, that legitimately helps you get your point across. The last thing is it possible for a wide variety of outcomes, or will they all be similar? This one isn't inherently related to fun, but it's tangentially related to fun. The more fun a game is, the more likely people are going to try to play it different ways. They're going to try to explore different things. They're going to say, well, last time we decided to go after the base deleter just with cyber assets, but this time I want to go after the base deleter while it's in the air with, you know, super cool base defense stuff. And you're more likely to get people that play that again. So slide, please. Is Agile Gaming fun? So a step down from should wargaming in general fun to do we think this is fun? I think so, but I'm biased. I also don't have a great track record with this, and I'm a little weird. Some of the most fun I ever had in my life was as a cadet. I got to help the FDNY run a large-scale disaster planning exercise, and I still have dreams about how much fun I had there. So if that kind of thing sounds like fun to you, I can guarantee you like all our games. If that kind of thing sounds like, Phil, you may have a social disorder, I'm sorry. So we're a little biased, but what I will add is there's something to be said about lighter games. I wrote this slide and Lexee PDF'd it, confident that we would have more people that had played Axis and Allies than we did World in Flames. You will always be easier to find players for Axis and Allies than World in Flames. And Checkers players will be more common than both of them. Light games are easy to make fun. They don't have to be a lot of fun. They just have to be a little fun. If I have to teach you the rules for 5 minutes and you have 10 minutes worth of fun, I win. So that's the way I see that, and that's how this interacts. So before I get to that last bullet point, I want to go over to my picture, which was from a campaign I was running in Dungeons & Dragons about a year ago. And I just put a thought piece under that. The commercial market willingly puts hundreds of hours into tabletop role-playing games, board games, video games. You can find huge subcultures out on Reddit or Facebook or any number of individual targeted forums and message boards dedicated nothing to learning about the game. If you guys know anybody who's serious about Warhammer 40,000, you know somebody that functionally has a doctorate in a fictional universe, because they will go on and on and on about that. And I am one of those people, so fair warning. But how do we get that here? One of the ways and one of the reasons people dive into that is because the core thing is fun to them. It is engaging. If you can make this the same way, you can spread enthusiasm for your concepts and your topics. But it always has to be tempered by, if all you're doing is having fun and you're not learning, the game isn't useful. It is possible to go too far in the fun direction. It would be really fun if we turned everything into a party game. And, you know, when something went wrong, you had to say a funny word or do a lap around the room or something like that. But it's going to be difficult to be taken seriously. People aren't going to stop and think about it because they're going to be too thinking about the ridiculous things you're asking them to do. So all I would say with that is that last bullet is important. So Frank, this was your question. What do you think? I'll wait while he types. Do we have any other questions, by the way? Lexi, you were looking up.
No, but I have a point to add about your funness.
Oh, absolutely, go for it.
Priority. So I enjoy playing games because they're fun. Phil will tell you this. We played a game called Burger Up and used it, or a commercial game called Burger Up. And that's like my latest kick. I'm off of Candyland now. I'm on Burger Up, so steps in the right direction. But anytime something comes up, even for a bureaucracy, I'm like, we should play the Burger Builder game. It's going to be so much fun. People love it. People love putting burgers together, especially for bureaucracy. And I champion that a lot. But the point of having fun is to get people to buy into this idea of like, hey, we're playing a war game. And then when we come out of it and, you know, Phil's moving the cards around and there's a winner, there's a loser, and all of these different things are happening during the game. We always have like 15, 20 to 30 minutes at the end where we sum up our initial findings, and then we go back and we make sure everyone who was a player or a participant understands what was learned from that game. So in the Burger Up example, our players or participants understood that they were building different things with the cards they had, similar to how they would be building a burger. But once we told them, hey, this is actually the operational implications what your building had, they understood, hey, I was not just here to have fun. I actually drove us towards making some operational decisions, or my decisions at this tactical level of building up a capability drove the strategy to reflect, you know, an example of this, etc. So in the Burger Up example, I think we had a couple of things, we'll call them like the veggie patties, and people just did not want to use the veggie patties, and that's a lesson in itself. So we note that and we say, hey, when you've been building things, you had this and this thing was cheap and it could have done the job, but you just showed a preference not to use it, and so let's talk about it and let's discover why. So yeah, sometimes it's a little bit of this subterfuge. We use fun to get people into it and buying into the game and the gaming aspect. And then we always like when people are surprised by how much they learn from Agile Gaming. I do. Awesome.
So I did see another couple questions. Think it's worth addressing. So one of them from Robert asked about what is our go-to game, or what are my favorite commercial games dealing with hybrid warfare. So hybrid warfare, for those unfamiliar, is sort of the mesh that is the interplay between insurgency and conventional warfare. The short answer is I don't have one particular game on that. I've only played a few games that cover it. It's covered to a degree in the Next War system by Mitchell Land, which I showed, Next War Taiwan, where anything you take as the PRC, you must pacify. And if you don't pacify, you risk partisans that disrupt your supply lines and get in the way. That does a decent job at it. I've got my eye on a game called Fitna, which I don't yet have a copy because it was only recently released. It's by a French firm called Nuts Publishing. Came out earlier this year, and that deals with the fight against ISIS from 2012 to 2019. That has some rules for how hybrid warfare works that I like, but I don't know how good they are because I don't have a copy yet. I do know on the coin end of the spectrum, I saw the coin series represented already. Strongly recommend the coin series. It's kind of a hybrid between a Euro game and a war game, but it does a very good job of teaching you what's it like on the operational or low strategic level to manage counterinsurgency. The most recent one of those I played was Colonial Twilight, which is about the French fight in Algeria. I played as the Algerians and I won my independence, so I was pretty happy about that. For strictly conventional games, I don't play a lot of modern conventional games. I played Next War. I want to play Fitna. I've had Urban Operations for about a year and a half, but I haven't actually had a chance to play it. I've got a couple other games computer-wise that are modern, like Combat Mission Shock Force, but I can't think there's exactly one that I would recommend to scratch the itch you're looking for. What I would recommend is play what's been described, if any of these seem like that's what you're looking for, and take what you can out of each of them. I would really like a Little Green Men game on the operational level, focusing around Russia and Crimea in 2014. I would play the heck out of that. But as I'm currently aware, the only games I know about that are tactical. There's one by Tiny Battle Publishing about the battle for an airport, or strategic. David Thompson has a game called Europe Divided. That's one of many, many flashpoints. So thank you for letting me ramble about games I played.
Hey, Phil, let me interrupt you for a second. This is Sebastian. So 2 other games I would recommend is Brian Train's print and play game. I think it's called Ukrainian Crisis. It's pretty simple, but it's a basic game on gray zone operations in that region. Another one that's forthcoming is by Brant from Armchair's Dragoon. I think the title is Orange Crush. It's not out yet, but there's a lot of hype about it, and I think it'll be good. And lastly, I will plug one of my student groups from this fall. They are designing sort of a high operational Ukraine hybrid warfare game that centers around attribution and 3 levels of control, which are physical control, information control, and financial control. So if you're interested in that, Robert, just shoot me an email. I'll get you contacted with my students. All right.
If you want to send that over to the Pentagon, I can promise it'll hit my table.
Only if you pay for it, Phil.
Sebastian, you have a question about hegemony, but I don't know the context of this.
Okay, so to answer Kate's question of what is RAND's hegemony considered, one, I wasn't part of the design team. I was part of the team that was made hegemony from its original DoD game into a commercial version. So I wasn't part of the design team, so I want to make that clear. But hegemony was designed initially for our clients at RAND, at OSD and DoD, to be a tool to help them create the NDS. So it's designed as an analytical, but also sort of an educational game, which they could explore various strategies for the NDS in a short amount of time, rapidly, over and over again. What hegemony became in the commercial version became an educational tool for a very specific type of demographic, which is essentially officers who are going to the Pentagon, political appointees who are going to the Pentagon, and other sort of senior level decision makers, because it doesn't look at operational or any of the sort of sexy DoD problem sets, like what happens if the Russians invade, right? Or what happens if North Korea does something silly on the Korean Peninsula. In terms of like, do I move my fighters and tanks there? It really looks at certain key levers that the DoD gets to pull, which is modernization, readiness, posture, and sort of other things like that. Sort of big theme muscle movements. So hegemony is really a strategic game in terms of how do I create a overall long-term strategy. Like hegemony is designed to think about strategy in like 5, 10, 15-year increments, versus sort of short-term operational games. And hegemony is really interesting in that way because you have to devote yourself to a strategy and allocate resources, but then you realize the real world and your adversaries don't allow you to take an easy road. So it's a very interesting game. And hopefully Goose will hold a hegemony session in person on campus sometime in the future whenever we're allowed back. But if you're interested in it, it's available for lots of money on our RAND website. And there'll be, I know other universities like Marine Corps University, Army War College, and others are sort of using hegemony for their strategic wargaming courses. And I cannot give discounts. They won't even give me a discount, and I work there. So you're barking up the wrong tree there. Any other questions before I hand it over for Phil and Lexi for last minute comments or sort of soapbox issues they want to jump on for the last few minutes, and then they can end it. Last questions, last call. All right. Well, Lexi, you go first. Any last comments, and you can hand it over to Phil, and then we'll end our session.
Nope. I was just going to recommend we'll stop recording, and then if people still have remaining questions they would like to ask not on the recording, we'll hang back for about 5 minutes if that's cool with you, Phil. Okay, on to you then.
So then, Phil, you can go.
Yeah, the last thing I would say to wrap it up on my end is understand that games are useful and seek to understand games the best you can. That will make your life easier as a wargamer, and will make your life easier as somebody that plays war games.
So on that note, I would like to thank everyone for attending our webinar this week, and thank our speakers, Phil and Lexi, for their awesome insights into the Agile Wargaming method. And hopefully we'll see you next week for our next one. Thank you, everyone.